More often than not, mergers and acquisitions fail, and they fail for a number of key reasons. Today I'm going to talk about a case study from a recent merger and acquisition integration project that we recently helped a client through. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital and business transformations. And when we look at our client base, most of our clients are private equity owned. Most of them are growing aggressively through mergers and acquisitions. And most of them struggle with how to integrate their mergers and acquisitions. So they go out and grow organically, acquire a bunch of companies, and then come to us to figure out how do we tie this all together? How do we operate as one company? And so what I wanted to do here today is talk about a real life lesson and a real life case study of a recent client that we worked with in helping them integrate their recent mergers. So this specific example that I want to talk about today is a $3 billion manufacturer and distribution company that sells home building products. They sell things that are used in residential and commercial construction. And they're a company that operates in a highly fragmented industry. They've gone out and acquired a number of different brands and locations throughout the world. In fact, they have over 10 different separate brands in the same industry. They have roughly 40 locations throughout the world. Much of those were acquired through acquisitions. And they have about 3,000 employees. And along with those different acquisitions came the use of 4 different ERP systems. So on the surface, they came to us and said, hey, we have these separate ERP systems. We've acquired a bunch of different companies in the market, and we need to figure out how to deploy new technology to help bring the company together and start to act as one company. So one of the biggest challenges that this client was facing, and the reason they hired us, is because they were struggling with a number of inefficiencies within the organization. The operations had become very siloed, which is understandable because they had gone out and acquired different companies, different brands, different ways of operating. And just as an example, they realized that they weren't getting the economies of scale and the leverage that they have in their procurement department. So they weren't leveraging and consolidating their procurement. They were operating with separate procurement departments, and they weren't getting the mass economies of scale negotiating leverage that you would expect to see with a larger company like them. They were also shipping from different locations, from different warehouses to satisfy single orders from clients. And they were also creating somewhat of a disjointed customer experience. So customers that were interacting with the different brands or the different companies under this one umbrella felt as though they were operating and dealing with different companies or entirely different companies. So those were some of the challenges that this company was facing. And so they hired us to come in and do a merger and acquisition integration strategy. And I'll talk about some of the steps we went through to help them through the process. So the first thing we undertook with this client was backing up and looking at the big picture of their overall transformation strategy, and even before that, looking at their overall business strategy. What is it they're trying to accomplish? What are they trying to become? What do they want that end state to look like from an executive vision level? And some of the biggest things we learned during this process were, one, they were hoping to operate like one company. They wanted the customer experience, as I mentioned before, to be singular and very common across the different brands, across the different locations, so that if you were interacting with this client as a customer in any part of the world, you would have a similar customer experience. They also wanted to drive cost out of the organization. They were highly inefficient with redundant activities and redundant functions throughout the world that were doing largely the same things, and they knew that they could save money by consolidating some of those functions, bringing some of them to more of a central location and more of a shared service model. So for example, their finance department, their IT department, HR, as a few examples, were areas that they knew they wanted to move to more of a shared service model that would be shared across the entire organization, which will ultimately drive increased efficiency, lower cost, and higher profitability. So those are just a few examples of the first things we went through, but at a high level, what we did was help them define what their overall strategy was, help them articulate that, and most importantly, help them articulate what this integration strategy would need to do and need to accomplish in order to support that higher level strategy. So in working with this client, we found that the company was operating essentially as 6 different regions. Even though they had 40 different locations, there was some regionalization and some commonalities that we could distill down to 6 different models, 6 different ways of operating. So one of the first things we did is we went in to analyze the business processes at each of the 6 regions. And the purpose of that activity was to identify where the commonalities were, because not everything was broken. There were things that were doing well and they were doing consistently across the organization. And then we identified the gaps, the things that were differences or variations in the way they were operating. And ultimately what we wanted to help them do was define how that future state operating model would need to look to support their goals and objectives longer term. So defining those high-level business processes, analyzing the processes, introducing best practices to the equation, and ultimately identifying how technology could enable some of those process improvements were some of the things that we helped them do during this business process exercise. So during our work and during our analysis, as I mentioned before, we found that the client was using 4 different ERP systems throughout the world. They were using 2 Tier 1 systems, one of the bigger ERP names that you've heard of, and they were also using 2 different niche or industry-focused solutions. And they all served a purpose. They were all working okay for each of the different parts of the businesses that were using it, but they were highly inefficient in the way they used technology. The technology did not integrate with one another. Data wasn't flowing. They didn't have a common view of the customer. So if a customer was multinational and was buying from this particular company in multiple parts of the world, they didn't have that visibility to see what was happening across the entire enterprise. So part of our analysis was looking at the systems they had, understanding where the systems were strong, where they were weak, where there were commonalities, and where there was opportunity to tie together more technology. And what was interesting about this project and this client is they led with technology. They at first wanted us to focus on identifying ways that they could leverage technology and create a standard platform. But as we quickly found, the business operations and the organizational structure were bigger problems that need to be addressed first. But regardless, we still went in, we analyzed the systems, and we wanted to define a plan for how they could leverage technology to enable some of these bigger picture goals that they've identified. In addition to looking at business processes and technologies and the overall strategy, we also went in to identify and analyze the organizational structure, the organization in general. We looked at things like the organizational design. What were the roles and responsibilities happening within this organization? Where were the commonalities and the synergies, and where were the broken, siloed parts of the organization? We also looked at the skill sets that they had in-house versus the skill sets they knew they would need to compete in the future, especially with new technologies and new business processes. We looked largely at the culture and really understanding the culture of the different parts of the organization so that we could create a cultural transformation plan that allowed them to create more of an aligned culture and, where appropriate, bend the cultures of some of the different parts of the organization so they were operating as one more cohesive culture. We also looked at change impacts. So as we had analyzed the business processes and identified business process improvements or potential process improvements, we also looked at what the impact to the organization would be if they actually executed on those improvements. So that change impact assessment was meant to be a key input into the overall organizational change strategy and plan. And then finally, we assessed the potential resistance to change. Every organization we work with, including this one, has some degree of resistance. The question isn't if there's going to be resistance, but where's the resistance going to come from? How severe is that resistance? And what are the root causes of the resistance? So part of the organizational assessment was meant to dig underneath the covers and dive into the organization and the culture to understand what the likely causes of resistance would be so that we could create a change strategy that would enable the ultimate integration between the different acquisitions they had made over the years. So once we had completed this analysis from the people, the process, the technology, and the strategy sides of things, we then defined what the overall integration strategy was going to be. And ultimately, and to summarize, we came up with a 3-year transformation strategy that aligned and focused on how the organization was going to drive some of these process changes, how it was going to drive the new organizational structure in the future, the new operating model, the new systems, and basically everything that needed to happen to be able to support the integration of all the acquisitions to be able to ultimately support the overall strategy of the organization. One example of a recommendation and a key part of the roadmap was defining how they were going to move to the shared services strategy. So I talked about earlier about how HR, finance, and IT were all examples of areas that they wanted to consolidate so they didn't have multiple redundancies throughout the organization, but instead would have more of a centralized common operating model and a common organization to support the entire organization. We also identified a whole host of business process improvements. There were a ton of business process improvements that some cases were dependent on new technologies, but in some cases were dependent on just rolling out new standard operating procedures. So while this client thought that technology was going to drive most of the change, it turned out there was a lot of change on the process and people side of things that were enabled without technology. So the roadmap accounted for all of that and looked at the things that could be done early on, the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, the low-cost, low-risk, high-value type stuff, as well as the stuff later down the line that included higher dollar, perhaps higher risk, and more technologically focused solutions as well. And then finally, but not least importantly, we also looked at the change strategy. We defined exactly how this organization was going to incrementally change the organization, the structure, move to that shared service model, migrate the people from where they were today to where they were going in the future. And that whole change strategy ended up becoming a key part of that integration strategy. And all of these things I'm mentioning, by the way, are things that should be core components of any successful integration strategy. So when we look back at this particular case study and some of the lessons learned and some of the things we learned as a team that does this all the time, we still learn a lot from doing this too. And there were three things we learned. The first is that it's important to lead with the business needs and the business operational needs. So we didn't really focus on technology until later in the analysis. Even though the client originally hired us, coming from a technology perspective, the CIO was the one that first reached out to us. It turned into a much broader, more strategic project than just a technology initiative. It became more of a true business transformation. So leading with the business, understanding what the strategy is, how the operational model should look in the future, and how the organizational model should look in the future are key components that allow you to drive and lead with the business first. A second is to have a clear vision for what this transformation means. At a high level, it's easy to define real high-level vague metrics or goals like we want to standardize operations, or we want to increase profitability, decrease inventory, increase our margins, create a better customer experience. Those are all noble goals that a lot of organizations have, both before and after merger and acquisition. But we need to unpack that more and understand what exactly it is we're trying to accomplish. What does a better customer experience mean to your customers? How exactly can we achieve inventory reductions, or how exactly can we increase our margins or increase our top line revenue? Those are all examples of things that we need to start with the business strategy and define in more detail how this overall integration and transformation strategy can help. And then finally, one of the biggest lessons from this client was that we want to cover the basics first. When we got through this entire analysis, after several months of working with this client, we were talking to the CFO, and one of the things he told us was, we realized through this exercise that we need to focus on the basics first before we ever start going out and acquiring expensive new technologies and deploying risky implementations. There's some real basic fundamental stuff we need to do to get our house in order first. And only then, after we've rolled out some of these process improvements and the organizational enhancements and created a more clear operating model for how we want to operate in the future, then you can bring in technology to overlay on top of that. So those were some of the lessons that resonated with this client and some of the things that we learned from this particular client as well. So I hope you found this information useful. I encourage you to download some of the content I've included before, which will help you through your merger and acquisition integration initiative or your overall business transformation and digital transformation initiatives. So thank you very much for your time, and hope you have a great day.